Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be tackling something that's pretty essential to the world of software.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking to test data. We've got some really interesting excerpts here from a larger document all about this topic.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area.
It really is. And, it might not sound super exciting at first, but trust me, folks, this stuff is important.
It really is.
I mean, think about it. We are absolutely surrounded by software.
Oh, yeah.
It's in our phones, it's in our cars these days. Heck, it's even in our toasters.
Pretty much everywhere you look.
And all that software. Before it can be, unleashed upon the world,
Right.
it needs to be tested.
Right.
And it needs to be tested rigorously.
Absolutely. Or things can go very wrong.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And that's where our topic of the day comes in.
That's right.
Test data. It's really the unsung hero of the whole software development process.
You can think of it as the fuel for all those tests.
Okay, I like that analogy.
It's the input that developers use to see how their software behaves under all sorts of different conditions.
So it's kind of like giving the software a trial run, right? Before it hits the big time.
Exactly. You want to make sure it can handle whatever the real world throws at it.
Now, our source material actually defines test data as
Let's see.
the input used to see if software behaves as expected.
Right.
But what does that actually look like in practice? Beyond just a definition.
Well, imagine you're building a bridge.
Okay.
You wouldn't just assume it's going to stand up on its own, right?
No, of course not.
You'd want to test it with different loads, stresses, make sure it can handle the weight of real traffic.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Got to make sure it's safe.
Test data is kind of like that for software.
Okay.
It's carefully chosen input designed to, simulate different scenarios, push the software to its limits.
So it's not just about making sure the software works under, perfect conditions.
Definitely not.
Got to see what happens when things get a little messy.
Right. Exactly. One of the things our source really stresses is that bad test data, it can be almost as dangerous as no test data at all.
Really?
If you're only testing for what they call the happy path.
Oh, right, when everything goes perfectly.
Exactly. You're going to miss all those little bugs,
No.
those vulnerabilities that might only show up in, specific situations.
So you're saying you got to try to break the software on purpose.
In a way, yes. You want to find those edge cases.
The whatchamacallids.
The unexpected inputs, the things that might cause it to crash, behave erratically.
Ah, I see. So you got to think like a user who's trying to mess things up.
It's a bit like that.
Oh.
You need to be creative and think of all the ways someone might use the software, even the ways it wasn't intended to be used.
I guess it makes sense. Find the problems before they find you.
Right, exactly. And speaking of finding problems, there was this case study mentioned in the source material
Oh, yeah?
where insufficient test data actually led to a pretty big software failure.
Oh, no. What happened?
A company ended up losing millions of dollars because they didn't do enough testing.
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty powerful argument for getting this right.
Absolutely. It really underscores how important thoughtful test data design is.
Right. And I'm guessing there's not like a one-size-fits-all approach here.
Not at all.
It's not like you can just use the same test data for every piece of software.
Yep.
Although,
The type of data you need depends heavily on what kind of testing you're doing.
makes sense. And speaking of different types of testing, I noticed our source material mentions a whole bunch. White box, black box,
Oh, yeah, there's a lot.
performance testing, security testing. It's a lot to keep track of. Where do developers even begin?
Well, the first step is really understanding what you're trying to achieve with the testing.
Right. What's the goal?
Exactly. Each type of testing has a different focus, and that'll dictate what kind of data you need.
Okay, so could you maybe walk us through an example? Like, what's the difference between, say, white box and black box testing? And how did the data come into play there?
Sure. So think of white box testing like looking under the hood of a car.
Okay, I can picture that.
You can see all the individual components, how they interact with each other.
Right.
So the test data here, it needs to be very targeted.
To specific parts of the code.
Exactly. It's about making sure every function, every line of code is doing what it's supposed to.
So very detailed and specific data.
You got it. Now, black box testing is more like interacting with the car as a driver. You don't know what's going on under the hood.
Right, I'm just focused on driving.
You just care about how the car responds to your inputs, the steering wheel, the pedals, the gear stick.
Okay, I'm following you.
So in black box testing, the data is more about simulating real-world usage.
So you're trying to cover all sorts of possible inputs, like both valid and invalid, to see how the software reacts.
Precisely.
Makes sense. But I gotta ask, how do you even come up with all that data? It seems like a pretty massive undertaking.
It can be, for sure, especially as software gets more and more complex.
Yeah, I bet.
The source material highlights a few different approaches to creating test data.
Okay, lay it on me. What are the options?
One option is to create it manually.
Just type it all in by hand?
Pretty much. It gives you a lot of flexibility, but as you can imagine, it can be very time-consuming, especially for large data sets.
Yeah, I could see how that would get old pretty fast. What else?
You could also copy data from a live production environment.
Ooh, so use real data from real users.
That's the idea. It's got the advantage of being, super realistic.
But I bet there are some downsides too, right?
There are, mainly privacy concerns.
Ah, right. You can't just go grabbing any old data. Gotta be careful with people's personal information.
Exactly. There are ethical considerations to keep in mind.
Okay, so manual creation and copying from production. What's the third option?
Well, the third option is using automated tools.
Oh, software that makes more software to test the software.
It's kind of like that. These tools can be really good at creating large data sets, much faster than a human could.
That makes sense.
They're efficient.
But I bet there are trade-offs there too.
There are. They can be a little less flexible than manual creation.
So it sounds like choosing the right approach for creating test data is like a balancing act.
Definitely.
You got to weigh the pros and cons of each method, right?
Exactly. You got to consider speed, flexibility, and of course, making sure the data is both realistic and ethically sourced.
This is all super interesting, but I got to admit, my head is starting to spin a bit with all these options and things to consider.
That's understandable. It's a lot to take in,
Yeah.
and we've only just scratched the surface.
Well, lucky for our listeners, there's a lot more to come. We'll be right back to keep digging into the world of test data.
There's a lot more to explore.
We'll talk about specific testing types and how they influence the data that's needed. So don't go anywhere. We'll be back in a flash.
We'll be right here.
And we're back. Before the break, we were talking about all the different flavors of test data.
Oh, yeah, there's quite a variety.
And you mentioned that each type of testing, kind of has its own specific data needs. Can we maybe dive a little deeper into some examples?
Sure.
Like, let's say, performance testing. What's that all about?
Okay, so performance testing, that's all about making sure your software can handle, the heat.
The heat.
Yeah, like the real world, all the stresses and strains of actual usage.
Oh, okay. So like making sure it doesn't crash when a ton of people are using it at the same time.
Exactly. Imagine like a popular e-commerce site during a big sale.
Black Friday?
Yeah, something like that. Thousands of people are all browsing, adding stuff to their carts, checking out.
Yeah.
If the website's not properly tested,
Uh-oh.
it could just crash under all that pressure.
That'd be a disaster.
Yeah, lost sales, frustrated customers. Nobody wants that.
No, definitely not. So how does test data help prevent that kind of meltdown?
Well, in performance testing, you use data that simulates that real-world traffic.
Oh, I see.
It's not about finding bugs so much as finding bottlenecks.
Bottlenecks.
Yeah, the things that slow the system down. The data needs to reflect real usage patterns.
So like thousands of people logging in at the same time?
Yeah, searching for products, buying things, all happening at once.
Wow, okay.
This lets developers see how the system performs under pressure.
So they can fix any problems before they become big problems.
Exactly. It's kind of like reinforcing a bridge before it collapses.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, what about security testing? I imagine that's a whole different ballgame when it comes to data.
You're telling me. Security testing, it's all about finding the weak spots before the bad guys do.
Oh, yeah. Got to keep those hackers out.
The source material actually highlights a few key things to focus on.
Okay, what are they?
Confidentiality, integrity, authentication, and authorization.
Wow, that's a mouthful. Can you break those down for me a little?
Sure. Think of it like this. Imagine you're testing a login form.
Okay.
You want to use data that tries to exploit any potential weaknesses.
So like trying to guess people's passwords?
Well, not exactly. It's more about trying all sorts of different inputs. Blank usernames, super long passwords,
Oh, I see. Trying to break in.
Yeah, you're basically trying to think like a hacker.
Got to be pretty devious to come up with all that.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that lead to a ton of data to keep track of?
Oh, yeah. Security testing can definitely generate a lot of data.
So how do they manage it all?
Well, organization is key.
Makes sense.
Our source really stresses the importance of documentation.
Ah, so writing everything down.
Right.
Got it.
Recording each test case, the data that was used, the expected outcome, the actual
So
result.
it's not just about creating the data, but also about learning from it.
Absolutely. You got to analyze those results, look for patterns.
I see.
And as software gets more complex, the amount of data just explodes.
Oh, I bet.
So having a good system for managing all that data, it's essential.
Okay, I'm getting a sense of just how big and complicated this whole thing really is. It sounds like being a tester takes a pretty special skill set.
Yeah, it does.
What would you say makes a good tester?
Let's see. According to the source material, a good tester needs a mix of technical skills, analytical thinking, and a whole lot of curiosity.
Curiosity.
Yeah. You got to be curious about how things work. Always asking questions, trying to figure things out.
And not afraid to break things, I bet.
Well, you got to be careful, but yeah, sometimes you got to push the limits to see what happens.
So a good tester is kind of like part detective, part scientist.
I like that. Yeah, they need to understand the software's requirements, design good test cases, analyze data to find potential issues.
Right. And they also got to be good at communicating their findings to the developers.
Absolutely. It's all about teamwork.
This has been really eye-opening. But before we move on, I'm curious about something.
What's that?
We've talked about different types of testing, but I also noticed the source material mentions these automated test data generation tools.
Oh, yeah. Those are becoming pretty popular.
Can you explain what those are and how they fit into the whole picture?
Sure. So as software development gets more complex, there's this push to release new versions faster and faster. And that's where automation comes in. These automated tools, they're designed to streamline the process of creating all that test data.
So instead of a team of people manually entering data, these tools can just, like, whip it up in a flash.
Pretty much. They can generate huge amounts of data, way faster than a human could.
Wow, that's impressive.
And it frees up the human testers to focus on more strategic stuff.
So it's not about replacing humans, but making them more efficient.
Exactly. It's all about working smarter, not harder.
Okay, I can get behind that. So these tools sound like they're pretty revolutionary for the testing process. But I gotta wonder, what does that mean for the humans who do this work? Are they going to become obsolete?
That's a question a lot of people are asking these days.
Yeah, it's a little scary.
While these automated tools are getting really sophisticated, they can't replace everything a human tester can do.
I see. So there are still things that humans are better at.
Definitely. Like humans are still way better at designing those really clever test cases.
Thinking outside the box.
Exactly. Anticipating scenarios a machine might not think of.
So it's not about humans versus machines, but about humans and machines working together.
That's the idea. I think of it as a partnership, where humans and machines each bring their strengths to the table.
That makes a lot of sense. But there's another thing that occurred to me as we were talking about all this.
What's that?
You know how AI is getting used in more and more software these days?
Oh, yeah. It's everywhere.
How do you even test that stuff?
That's a really good question. And honestly, it's something the industry is still figuring out.
Right. It's like a whole other level of complexity. You're not just testing the software itself, but the AI that's driving it.
Exactly. And it's not just about making sure the AI works. It's about making sure it's ethical. Yeah, like making sure it's not biased against certain groups of people.
Oh, wow. That's a whole other can of worms.
It is. But it's something we need to be thinking about, especially as AI gets more powerful.
This has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I've learned so much about the hidden world of test data. And speaking of hidden worlds, we're going to take a quick break and come back to explore this whole AI testing thing even further.
It's a lot to unpack there.
So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to wrap things up. And we are back for the final part of our deep dive into all things test data.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has.
Yeah.
I gotta say, I feel a whole lot more informed about, the hidden world behind all the software we use every day.
Yeah, it's definitely an area that doesn't always get the attention it deserves.
Right. But as we've been discussing, it's absolutely crucial. I mean, we're talking about making sure the software that powers our lives is actually reliable and does what it's supposed to do.
Couldn't agree more.
So before the break, you mentioned that the source material kind of hinted at this pretty interesting question.
Oh, yeah.
About how we even go about testing AI-powered systems.
Right, because it's not just about testing the software anymore. It's about testing the AI that's driving it.
Exactly. And that feels like a whole new frontier, right? In the world of testing, I mean.
It really is, and it comes with a whole new set of challenges.
So can we maybe unpack that a little bit? What makes testing AI so different?
Well, for one thing, the testing goes way beyond just functionality.
So it's not just about, does it work?
Right. We have to think about things like bias, fairness, and unintended consequences.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but I'm also a little confused.
Sure.
Can you give us an example? Like, how might bias show up in an AI system?
Sure. Imagine you're building an AI-powered hiring tool,
Okay.
one that uses data to screen job applicants. Now, if the data that was used to train the AI is biased in some way,
Oh, I see.
let's say it contains, historical hiring patterns that reflect gender or racial discrimination.
Right, because those patterns would be baked into the data.
Exactly. And then the AI system could end up perpetuating those biases.
Wow. So even if the AI itself isn't intentionally biased, the data it learns from can make it biased.
That's the danger.
Right.
And that's why testing for bias is so important.
So how do you even go about doing that?
Well, you need to use diverse and representative data sets.
To make sure the AI is learning from a wide range of perspectives.
Right. And you have to very carefully analyze the results, look for any signs of potential bias.
It sounds like a lot of work.
It is. It's not easy, but it's absolutely critical for ensuring that these AI systems are fair and equitable, for everyone.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So testing in this age of AI, it's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
What do you think are the biggest challenges and maybe even opportunities for testers in this new landscape?
Well, one of the biggest challenges, honestly, is just staying ahead of the curve.
Because AI is evolving so quickly.
Exactly. It's changing constantly. So testers need to constantly update their knowledge and skills.
So it's a lot of learning on the job.
Pretty much. And our source material actually talks about this need for more collaboration
Collaboration between who?
between testers and AI experts
Yeah.
to make sure the testing methods are, keeping up with the latest advancements.
So it's not just about testers becoming AI experts themselves, but about being able to work together effectively.
Exactly.
And, as we've been discussing, testing AI systems, it's not just a technical issue. There are all these ethical considerations, too.
For sure.
So testers will need to be able to think about those things as well.
Absolutely. And work closely with, maybe ethicists, social scientists, all sorts of different stakeholders.
Wow, it's like testing is becoming this really interdisciplinary field.
It really is.
So yeah, the future of testing.
Mm,
Sounds like it's going to be pretty dynamic.
it is.
A little daunting, honestly, but also super exciting.
I agree. It's a really interesting time to be in this field, and it's only going to get more interesting.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Wow, that went by fast.
It did. We started with the basics of test data, went through all sorts of different testing types, talked about those cool automated tools, and even touched on, the whole world of AI and what that means for the future of testing.
It was a lot to
It
cover.
really was. But I feel like we've given our listeners a lot to think about.
Hopefully so.
And, for our listeners out there, the next time you're using a piece of software, whether it's an app, a website, whatever, take a moment to appreciate all the hard work that went into making sure it actually works.
All those hours of testing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as technology keeps evolving, the role of testing is only going to become more important.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of test data.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and most importantly, keep those apps running smoothly.
See you next time.